think we are ready to start. If anyone joins us, they can just take a seat. As you know, today we are here for the conference on self-determination. The title is Rethinking Self-Determination, and it's organized by International Communities Organization in partnership with New England Journal on Public Policy, which is the editor is today here with us, Patrick O'Malley. And we have here James Holmes, the ICO director, and James Summers. He is going to present us during the first panel. I'm going to introduce our panelists later on, Mara and Michael Donlan. Thank you for coming here. And as anyone doesn't know me, my name is Kübra Kalkandelen. I'm leading the projects at the International Communities Organization since its establishment. My background in human rights, I was over 10 years, I have been working with several civil society organizations around the world, in Turkey, in Norway, in France, and here in the UK. And today we're going to start with a presentation with James on ICO. James, if you're ready, I'm going to prepare the presentation.
Thank you. Kubra, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for being here today. So as Kubra said, my name is James Holmes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ICO, a little bit about the vision of the ICO and the future of the ICO, and then we'll get into the day. But I'd like to begin by paying tribute to Kubra and to her colleagues for organising today. A lot of work goes into something like a conference, even what we designed to be a small conference as this is. So Kubra, thank you for all you've done, and I'd also and to her team, and I'd also like to thank all our panelists who are coming here today to present their views and their papers. They do take a lot of time to prepare for these things, so I'm very grateful to everybody who's agreed to join us today. And there'll be more people joining us during the day. I think some are coming and going depending on which subjects interest them and when they're speaking. So I want to tell you a little bit about the International Communities Organization. I'll tell you very briefly about myself. My day job is that I'm Chief Executive of an investment bank, and we have an office in London, which coincidentally is about 100 yards from where we're sitting. And we have an office in Frankfurt, we have an office that's just opened in Geneva. And as well as having all the sort of areas you would expect a small bank to have, we have a wealth management division, we have a fund management division, we have a stockbroking division. We also have an impact investing division. And I've introduced that and started it because I have a real passion for trying to make the world a better place. And I think all of us are in this room because that's a view that we share. And I do find that the older you get, the more you come under pressure with mortgages and families and things like that to lose those principles, and I've tried very hard not to. And that is the reason why I set up and have funded the International Communities Organization, which Kubra runs, as she said at the beginning. So the purpose of ICO is self-determination. Now, the meaning of self-determination is probably better known to a lot of you than it is to me, but let me tell you what I mean by self-determination and why it's something that I'm passionate about. It seems to me that many years ago, borders were set in a very arbitrary way, and the world is full of people who believe that they are trapped in the wrong country, who believe that they do not have the opportunity to express their cultural rights, their political rights, who believe they do not have the opportunity to develop their community and their society as they would wish to see it. So very basic, but then I'm a lay person, but that is something that I'm very passionate about. Because if you look around the world as an enthusiastic amateur as I am, you see that it's full of wars, full of conflicts, and many of them, most of them I would say, come down to the issue of self-determination in one way or another. And that's where my passion for this work comes from, and my desire to set up and to back something like the International Communities Organization. So we're here not to take sides, we're here to enable, we're here to work with communities, we're here to give communities an opportunity to work for themselves, with themselves, and for the betterment of their community or society, and we'll leave communities to decide what that is. It may be a city, it may be a region, it may be a people spread out in a particular country, or even more than one country. But we leave that to the peoples themselves to decide. So our vision is the world is full of international organizations that work with countries, we're an international organisation that wants to work with peoples. And in order to do that, we want to be credible, we want to be mainstream. We're sitting here in Chatham House today and I'm wearing a tie because we want to be mainstream and we want to be credible and we want to be accepted by the countries of the world. ICO's vision is not to break up nations. ICO's vision is to keep nations together where it's possible, but to give autonomy to people and to allow people to make their own decisions and the decisions that are best for their community. So, how are we going to do that going forward? Because clearly as a new and relatively small organisation, the opportunity for us to make an impact on the face of it would appear to be fairly limited. So we realised that we had to work in a big way, and we had to have a big vision if we were going to make a difference. So using my day job, I have, and in fact the agreement was signed only 10 days ago, I'm very pleased to tell you that we have secured 200 million to develop an ICO centre which will be built over the course of the next 3 years just north of Vienna. And this will become the focus of our work. And that is why, as I'm speaking, this artist's impression is up of the centre. And you can see that we're going to have a non-profit university on that centre. It's already been formed, it's already accredited, and many of the courses it's going to offer are not charged at all. There are conference centres, there are conference halls, and these one day might be for meetings with peoples from different countries, or between them and the country that they live in. We have lecture rooms, of course, as you'd expect, because part of it's going to be a university. We have hotel accommodation for delegates. We have student accommodation for people who are going to come and study with us. And the focus of this entire centre is self-determination. And the focus of this centre is to give peoples an opportunity to come and be helped. And what I mean by that is helped by people, and I'm not including myself, helped by people who actually have the knowledge that a lot of communities would benefit from in terms of looking to their future and developing their future. So what do I mean by that? Well, the ICO Centre will have lawyers there. And these will be lawyers who will be experts in international relations, international law, and constitutional law. And they will be able to sit with peoples, communities, cities, regions, and they'll be able to talk about international law. They'll be able to give them this type of practical advice that helps community representatives to craft their own policies and their own arguments. So that's one area. A second is academics. Again, people who are able to talk about the history, who are able to talk about history of treaties, history of relationships between countries. Policy experts who are actually able to help communities form their own policies and their own ideas. Because in my view, it's by doing this that their arguments are going to be strengthened. And it's by doing this, we're encouraging people down a peaceful path, we're encouraging people to look at alternatives to current processes that perhaps aren't working. We're empowering communities with ideas, with policies, with arguments. The centre will also have ex-diplomats, a list of ex-diplomats, who hopefully will bring their contact list with them. And they'll be able to introduce communities to the right people. They'll be able to introduce communities to international organisations where they can make their arguments, where they can be heard. And it's deliberately, by building this just north of Vienna, it's deliberately near the UN campus in Vienna. So part of what ICO's centre will do is introduce communities, introduce regions, peoples to UN ambassadors, to UN organisations, to allow them to make representations to the Economic and Social Council, which is a mechanism that we can employ. And ICO itself will seek affiliation with the United Nations, which is one of the processes that the UN allow. And all of this will be to do something that is mainstream and that's accepted. And that's the purpose of it. Mainstream and accepted. Empowering communities, giving them the opportunities to come, to debate, to share ideas, to learn good practice, to share good practice, and to get access to that expert advice that they need. And this is, in my view, the most exciting bit of it all. We will not have any charge to these regions, communities, peoples at all. That is a service that will be provided from this centre to allow people to live out or seek and live out their aspirations. I've mentioned the university, so there'll also be a university base there. The university is already in existence, is already fully accredited, it already has students, so we've built that too, really exciting. It's about to open a small centre in Belfast, which we signed the lease on last year. Belfast, because there are inter-community issues in Belfast. And we hope in 3 years it will be open at this site just north of Vienna too. That will seek to train emerging leaders, emerging community leaders, tomorrow's representatives, because it's people who are now, even in their teens, but in their 20s, who are in their 30s, who, if we can get hold of them now and help craft their views, their ideas, take the skills that they have and build on that, then they are the people who hopefully tomorrow will be able to have a big influence on their society and the future of their society. So it's a big vision, it's an exciting vision. It's going to be 3, maybe even nearly 4 years in the making. Those of you who are thinking how is this all going to work may already have spotted that each element of this has the capacity to generate its own money. So although the services themselves will be at no charge, the hotel will be run by a hotel company. The student accommodation will be run by a student accommodation company. The conference centre, the lecture halls, offices will be available for commercial letting when they're not being used by ICO. So there'll be an opportunity to actually make sure that the centre is self-financing and can continue to operate, we hope, for 50 or 100 years. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's our vision. That's what we're seeking to do. To come back to today, this, I hope, will be the first of a number of conferences like this that we will hold, that in a completely non-partisan way will look at all the different methods, ideas, opportunities for people and peoples around the world to live their own dreams and to hopefully do so in a peaceful way, and to offer, amongst all the other offerings there are in the world, we're a very small part, but to offer perhaps an opportunity for a peaceful approach to some of the worst conflicts that there are in the world, and for some of the peoples who feel trapped and who feel they don't get the opportunity to come out and be heard. And that's what we want to do at ICO, and that's our vision, and it's a 30-year vision, and I'm excited by it, and you're all very welcome this morning, and I hope you have a good and positive day. If there's time, I'm happy to answer any questions, but thank you very much for listening, and welcome again.
Thank you, James. Thank you. Actually, we would like to take the questions at the end of the panel. If you have any questions to James also, although he is not presenting a paper, please feel free to note your comments at the end of this panel. Maybe we can have Mikhail Dolman to the panel table. Thank you, James. And Professor O'Malley, if you would like to also contribute to the opening speech.
Yeah, good morning. And welcome to all of you. As James laid out a vision for the International Community Organization, I think we are all lucky to be part of the initiation of that vision, a vision that will take 3 or 4 years to get fully underway in Vienna, but a vision that will continue in small steps over the number of years as we hold more conferences such as this. I'll just very briefly say that at this moment that I am a professor of peace and reconciliation at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I've been involved in peace efforts in various countries around the world, most particularly in Northern Ireland, where I've been working now for almost 50 years. I spent 20 years in South Africa during the last days of apartheid and its transformation from apartheid to democracy. And I've worked in Iraq, and I have an NGO called the Forum for Cities in Transition. And this is how I came to know James. The Forum for Cities in Transition in a way, deals with many issues related to self-determination. It is founded on the principle that one divided society is in the best position to help another. basis of that hypothesis, we've been bringing people from up to 15 cities around the world together every year, where they learn from each other's experiences and carry out joint projects to further reconciliation in their own countries. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the early afternoon. I'm also the founding editor of the New England Journal of Public Policy. This journal has been in existence now for 34 years. It was founded initially as a print publication, dealing mostly with issues relating to public policy in Massachusetts and New England. But in the last decade, we've branched out into turning it into mostly a journal that deals with foreign affairs and issues germane to how societies work, how we deal with extremism, how we deal with war. We've published special issues on AIDS, on war itself, on poverty and homelessness, on extremism. And we will publish proceedings of this conference. You will probably have about a month to make final changes to your paper, to your presentations, and you will submit them to us. We'll send you a guideline as to the format we need those papers in, and we should have publication scheduled for September or October this year. So you'll be working closely with me in the coming months, and I look forward to that. We have a fantastic editorial process, so we are very good at turning often what's difficult to understand papers into readable materials. Because one of the core principles of the journals I've edited is that the articles must be readable. Sophisticated lay people must be able to understand them, and too often academic journals are just really for academics. This journal is for people who want to think and be knowledgeable about public affairs. I don't know how to interpret our data. We had, since we went online in 2009, we have had 742 papers that were downloaded. According to the data that appears when I Google the New England Journal, it's 340 downloads in the last 10 years. The data says that it had 75,000 downloads last year. And if I Google on it today, it'll tell me that up to 200 people are reading it. Now, I have no idea where these statistics came from, but we have a readership that goes all the way across the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Australia, and from countries in Europe. On self-determination in the afternoon, I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about a particular issue related to self-determination, and that is Brexit, which can be conceived as and understood in the context of self-determination. But for the moment, I'll hand the chair back to Cooper, and I think we can get into a round of applause to Cooper for all the effort that she's put into this, and to the staff at AntiNationality, the community organisation, and to James, thank you.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank the ICO team. We have with us today Adu, Fred, and upstairs Kenza and Ben here, that they support the organization of this conference. Thank you everyone, and thank you for participating here, the audience. I would like to shortly introduce the panel presentations, the panelists. We will start with James Summer, who is a lecturer in law in Lancaster University. And then we will have a presentation from Mare. Mare is a former Macedonian diplomat in the UK. She is also an independent researcher for Macedonia. She holds a PhD and a master's at the UCL. She is also a member of the Cost Action EU Foreign Policy. We will also have another presentation. I'm sorry, I need to also add their presentation titles. You all have the program. You can follow the program, by the way, the timing. If you don't have, we have the back desk. I think everyone can hear me without the mics, right? Okay, I don't need it. Thank you. It's much better. So, if you don't have the program, it's on the table behind you, because it's very important to go through the timetable. We will start with the first panel. James Summers from the University of Lancaster, lecturing law, will present self-determination in the human rights covenants as a claimable right. Then Mare, the former Macedonian diplomat in the UK, will present a paper on European Union integration. We see national self-determination. And Mikhail Donlan, joining us from the UMass, United States, an independent researcher for the University of UMass, will present a very interesting paper on self-determination and climate change. Then we will have the discussion time. Then you will have a chance to ask your challenging questions to the panelists. And then we will head to the coffee break. We will lead you the coffee room. So thank you. Then we can start with James Summers.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So my can we get the background going?
Yeah.
Okay, so my paper concerns a legal problem, and this is an opportunity which has sort of hung in the air for a very long time, and an opportunity which has been rather frustrated. And this is the idea that you could actually claim a right of self-determination under the human rights covenants. And the right of self-determination famously is presented as the first article of the human rights covenants. The twin covenants are the main UN legal instruments dealing with human rights, and famously self-determination was presented as human right number 1. And the justification for this is that it was considered to be the prerequisite for human rights, and this is strongly argued that it should be positioned in this place as a common article to both covenants, as it was equally relevant to the foundations of human rights in both instruments. So that's the sort of irony attached to that. Now, as we will see, that didn't quite work out, and for a very long time it seemed impossible that you could actually claim rights under the covenants. How can you claim human rights in international law? Self-determination in international law. At the moment, there is only one current human rights instrument that actually allows this, and this is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The African Charter contains a range of people's rights between Article 19 and Article 34, ranging from the equal rights of peoples and their right to self-determination to people's rights to an adequate environment for their development. And there have indeed been communications under the Charter. For a while it looked like the African Commission didn't really know what to do with these communications, but it has engaged with those communications. It has identified peoples for the purposes of the Charter. And we can see, not necessarily ideally working, but we can see a working legal framework in which these rights could be claimed. People's rights can also be claimed in a much more indirect fashion through the American Convention on Human Rights, and what we see is Article 1 of the Human Rights Covenant being brought in essentially to collectivize individual human rights. And this has come up in a number of cases before the Inter-American Court, from 2001 in the Awastingni and Nicaragua case. The court has looked for ways in which the right to property, which is contained in Article 21 of the Convention, can be given a collective communal interpretation. And one of the ways that it has done this, it's done this in a couple of cases, Saramaka and Kalina and Lokono, has been to read it in light of Article 1 of the Covenants, to give it a collective context. Nonetheless, this is self-determination coming in indirectly to interpret what would otherwise be essentially individual rights. So we have Article 1 being used, we have self-determination being used, but in the case of the Inter-American Court, it's being used indirectly. It's being used to inform other human rights and to bring its perspective into those rights. So what sort of perspectives is it talking about? I'm sure you're all quite familiar with the rights that we're talking about, but let's just have a quick look at them. So Common Article 1 of the Covenant says all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. What we can see within that formula already is a political aspect to the right to freely determine your political status, and then the economic, social and cultural aspects of the right. Now, in principle, this divides up between the two covenants. The two covenants divided into a civil and political covenant and an economic and social and cultural covenant. And the two committees have seen their roles in implementing these two aspects of the right. Now, the second part, which is also then becomes very significant, especially when we're talking about economic and social aspects, all people just make their own ends, and I've edited this down for to avoid a very long, complicated and long-winded bit. They have the right to freely dispose of the natural wealth and resources, and in particular, in no case can a people be deprived of their own means of subsistence. So this is the provision that's common to both covenants. Both of the covenants contain this provision, and that relates to self-determination. In the civil and political covenant, there's also a provision in Article 27 on the rights of persons belonging to minorities. And significantly, it is the persons belonging to minorities who have the right, not the minority groups themselves. And that is the big distinction between Article 1 and Article 27. In Article 1, it is the people as a group who have the right, whereas in Article 27, it is the individual belonging to the minority. And that has an important implication for how you can then claim these things. So again, just a little bit of background about how you can claim these rights. So the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has an optional protocol, and it's been around for quite a long time, and it has a lot of parties. It's the biggest instrument of claiming covenant rights, and you can claim rights in the Civil and Political Covenant to the Human Rights Committee. A more recent development is the optional protocol that's been attached to the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. This entered into force in 2013 and currently has 24 parties. It's not a huge number, but we can see within those parties, we can see some South American countries, countries like Finland with an indigenous population as well. So, and what I'll be focusing on is not so much this one, but the second one, which is a much more important instrument, I would argue, in the idea of Article 1 actually being the subject of legal claims. Why is this the case? Well, essentially, one of the problems that came up when the covenants were being drafted, and this was in the early stages of the decolonisation process, was there was a great desire to include an article on self-determination of peoples. This was the time at which countries were starting to become independent, and there was an accelerating dynamic behind that. It was seen that more and more countries were becoming independent, and the countries in the UN at the time, many of them wanted to show their sympathy for this movement, and also to inspire it and to accelerate it, and to bring it within a sort of legal formula. So self-determination was brought into the Human Rights Covenants, and it was positioned as sort of human right number one, the prerequisite for human rights. At the time, a lot of countries who were rather sceptical of this provision said, well, that's all very nice, but what is a people? How are you going to define a people? We have no definition of people, and if you bring it in, then you're just going to have people fighting over what this means. Those concerns were largely brushed aside because there was a desire to make this statement. The problem is this issue of definition, which is foundational to any claim to Article 1, then essentially was dropped to the lap of the committees that implemented the covenants. And the Human Rights Committee was the first of these committees. So in the early 80s, it dealt with a claim from the Micmac Tribal Society, a tribal band in Canada. And the Micmac communication was about, we have right to self-determination under Article 1 of the Covenants, and we believe that we'd be denied it because Canada won't recognise us as our own state. The committee said, well, you know, you brought this communication, these particular authors, and you're claiming to represent the Lubicon people. We're not convinced you actually represent people, because you're an individual and you're claiming the rights of a people. So in order for us to really address this, then you have to show that you speak for the people, and we're not convinced that you do that. The next communication that came along the line, and this then really exposed the essential problematic dynamic behind Article 1. So this whole issue about bringing this committee right into this issue of identifying peoples is the Lubicon Lake case. And in this case, I mean, the previous criticism was, you're claiming people's rights, but how do we know you speak for the people? In this case, it was brought by Bernard Omanayak, who was the Grand Captain of the tribe. He was their accepted representative and leader. So this old criticism that they raised in Micmac, oh yeah, well, we just don't know that you speak for your people, that wasn't really an option now for them to say. It was, well, you know, everyone accepts that he does speak for the people. So how do we deal with this? So they went back to the optional protocol, and they said, well, look, the way we read the optional protocol is that it covers all the rights in the covenants except Article 1. It deals with human rights, which is subject to individual communications, and we'll deal with those. We're not going to deal with people's rights, and we're just not going to go there. And they said in this case, and they said it in a number of different cases, you know, we're not going into this whole issue about what a people is. And in later cases, they said it's not up to us to decide whether the group in question should be considered a people for Article 1. The common practice that has been taken by the Human Rights Committee, and a good example is Palmer Peru in 2009, is that you have people, and in this case this is a member of the Aymara tribe. She brought a claim under Article 1, essentially over damage to the natural resources in her territory, which were depriving her means of subsistence. The Peruvian government dug wells, they dried out grazing land for her llamas, and it prevented her community from essentially subsisting. So she brought it down under Article 1 in relation to Article 1.2 on subsistence. The Human Rights Committee said, we're going to look at this in Article 27, it's a minority rights issue, we'll deal with that. And they addressed it under Article 27. Now, arguably, they took the same sort of considerations under Article 27, but they didn't go into self-determination. So in a sense, the Human Rights Committee has closed the door on individual communications on self-determination. What about the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights? That has been more open to the idea. And this hasn't been tested yet, but so this is the interesting question. But when they were discussing the optional protocol, they said, and there was a sense that the Human Rights Committee, by simply slamming the door on this issue, had effectively thrown one right out of the implementation of the covenants. This wasn't a satisfactory situation. So the way they approached it is, look, the stuff about political rights, the stuff about wanting to secede, that's the civil and political aspect of self-determination. We're dealing with economic, social, and cultural aspects of self-determination. So we think that As long as if any issue is related to those aspects of self-determination, we think this is something that could be a subject of individual communications. So that door has been left open. Now, how it will work out when it's tested is another matter. But at the moment, this is a door that is open. And in terms of the possibilities how these claims could be brought in relation to the economic, social, and cultural aspects of self-determination, the committee has also given a sort of sense of where these might fall in its general comment number 15 on the right to water, in which it called on state parties to ensure that there's adequate access to water for subsistence farmers and for securing the livelihood of indigenous peoples. And they specifically related this right, which actually falls under Article 11 of that covenant, and they tied it to Article 1.2 on self-determination and protection of subsistence. So they didn't have to bring this in, but they specifically brought in the idea of, in this case, access to water as a resource, as being a subsistence issue relating to people's rights under the covenants. And what I would argue that is, and I argue it in a recent article for the International Journal on Minority and Group Rights, is that subsistence is really pivotal to understanding group rights in a sense, and it provides a nexus to other rights within the covenant. And these can be rights to water, rights to food, rights to shelter. And in particular, especially if we look at the jurisprudence that's emerged from the Inter-American Court, the African Commission, and the African Court, the crucial nexus has been with the right to property. Now, the right to property is not something that's actually found in the covenants. When they were busy drawing up the list of human rights that should be put in the covenants, the right to property was left out for various political reasons, but it never made it into the covenants. And one of the potential things that we can see here is at least some revival of a right to property through subsistence, in the sense that if we look at cases like Saramacca or Galena and Nakona, or cases from the African Commission of NGOs or the community, then it has been subsistence which has provided this link. And 3 minutes over, right? Okay. So it's subsistence that provides this link. So that, I would argue, is the way in which this could be approached, that you could relate rights in relation to property and in relation to economic and social cultural rights to people's rights through subsistence, and the ways in which that can be interpreted. Now, the big issue, again, this is a big undeveloped issue, which remains open, and it will be up to see, it will be down to the committee to see how it deals with this issue, is standing. Do you have standing to bring a claim under Article 1? Now, this is what frustrated the author of the Micmac complaints. They just said, well, how do we know you speak for a people's right? And this is the big difference. So with human rights normally, it is, how does this relate to me as an individual? I am a victim, I can bring a claim. That's really quite straightforward. But in relation to people's rights, that is a really difficult issue. How do you claim to be the victim of a people's right, a right that is held and exercised collectively? That's a big problem. In the African Charter, this is less of a problem, because you don't need to be a victim of a right in the African Charter to bring a claim. It's open for civil society organisations to bring a claim on behalf of the people without proving that they are the victim of that right. And that's something that is very significant, and the African Charter has not got bogged down with this issue of, are the authors of this communication actually victims of a right? That is not the case with the covenants. So in particular, the optional protocol to the civil and political covenant talks about you having to be a victim. You can either bring it on behalf of a victim or you are the victim. If you're going to bring it on behalf of a victim, you have to have their consent. So you've either got to suffer a violation, or you've got to represent the people. Those are the two ways. So, can you suffer a violation of a people's right? Again, from the African Charter, we can see that if individuals suffer human rights violations on a sufficiently large scale, the sort of scaling up of individual rights, that could then turn into a people's rights. And in fact, what we see in the African Commission is essentially you start with an individual right, say something like the right to property. If it involves the whole community, then the right to property also becomes the right to resources. In the Ogoniland case, the right to health applied to a community becomes the right to a satisfactory environment. So you can scale up individual human rights violations, and that's one possible way in which you could do that. The other one is then through consent. So we saw in Lucan Lake, there was no question that the author was labeled the leader and representative of the people. There are, however, there is one sort of question that comes from this, and this obviously would work for indigenous groups where you have clearly accepted leadership. One of the questions though that came out in the Saramacca and Suriname case before the Inter-American Court is the possibility, though, that the authors might not share the same interests or perspective as the traditional leader. So one of the objections that came out in this case was that the paramount leader of the Saramacca was not consulted. And it was argued, well, there wasn't consent for this communication. The court, however, said, look, this is a treaty, and as a human rights treaty, we have to interpret it in light of the principle of effectiveness. In light of that, we will interpret the authority to make the communication broadly. We will not necessarily limit it to the traditional leadership. And we can see this coming up in cases that have already been brought before the Human Rights Committee. So we have cases like Maweepan in New Zealand and Pada in Finland. And what these cases have revealed, now these have had to come under Article 27, but I think that the considerations are very relevant. In each case, what you have is essentially a minority within a minority. So the Maweepan complaint was brought by a minority of Maori tribes who were objecting to a fishing agreement with New Zealand. In Pada and Finland, this was a difference between really the regulation of reindeer culling or harvesting, and the differences between one branch, one sort of herding cooperative, and another one. In one case, essentially their argument is that the quotas that were set in one area didn't work for them because their area was a bit wilder, more remote, and there were a lot more wolves around picking off their reindeer. So the sort of quotas that worked for one branch of the Sami were inappropriate to the other. So this suggests perhaps when possibility of communications are raised, a wider interpretation of who might represent a people if you're going down a representation route. So to conclude, communications are under Article 1 of the Covenant. The Human Rights Committee has essentially closed the door to the Civil and Political Covenant, but the door is potentially open under the Economic and Social and Cultural Rights Covenant. In terms of content, I think a claim is likely to hinge on the relationship between economic and social rights and people's rights through subsistence. And then there's the issue of standing as to how you claim to be a victim of those rights. And again, I think the subsistence can provide that nexus, either that or you have to show that you have consent, and then that raises the question of who can speak on behalf of other people. So that's my
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear about the relationship between other rights and right to self-determination, especially right to water, right to health, and how the rights are interrelated and interdependent, as the Universal Declaration of Rights also mentioned at its beginning. Now I would like to, we need to also use time wise. This is why we are starting with Mara's presentation, European Union integration and national self-determination.
Thank you, Kubra, and thank you to the international organization, the communities organization, for organizing this conference. My presentation is going to be on the complicated relationship between European integration on one hand and national self-determination on the other hand. The European project was a peace project in its essence, and it developed in the aftermath of the Second World War because it was believed that nationalist rule should be replaced by a common path in order to secure peace in the continent, and it involved forsaking sovereign exclusivity in policy making. For this reason, the European project was conceptualized as anti-national in principle, or at the very least understood to be supranational or post-national. The Treaty of the European Union, in its Article 1, states that it marks a new stage in the process of creating an ever closer union amongst the people. The EU would use terminology such as consolidation versus fragmentation, or unity and diversity. And European Commission President Mr. Juncker himself has said he was very vocal against further attempts to deconstruct the bloc into national subdivisions, saying that there will be no future of Europe of single nations. Both ideologically and systemically, then, the European project is seen as incompatible with the pursuit of self-determination of peoples and sovereignty. In fact, member states agree to give away a piece of their sovereignty when they decide to join the European Union, because they are agreeing to consensual decision-making. In fact, even the choice to enter the European Union as a member is not an act of self-determination, because it is not simply the will of the country that accedes, but it needs to be approved by the other member states as well. There is a very close correlation with identity. Identity is at the core of everything related to self-determination. What is a people? How they define themselves? How they see themselves? How they want their future to look? This is at the essence of self-determination. And just like identity creates loyalty towards a nation state, the European Union as a supranational entity would like to foster such an identity that would create loyalty and a sense of belonging to the European Union. Naturally, this is not an easy task, because as of today, there is no such thing as a European demos, as a collective. The European Union is consisted of 28 individual nation states, and arguably many more peoples within those limits that have all separate identities. So it would be unrealistic to expect that this pan-European or continental identity would replace national identities anytime soon. So what most politicians would try to propose is to have a sense of dual identity, a sense of loyalty towards both nation and Europe. And this goes along with this idea of replacing the nation state as the optimal political form of governance. Now, once we know this ideological background, we can look at how the EU views the principle of self-determination of peoples. I've gone through their position by exploring EU law, political statements made by the EU representatives, and of course their practice of state recognition. There is no mention in the treaties of the European Union of a right to self-determination of peoples, or self-determination in general. The question arises because self-determination is such a fundamental principle of international law, and international law is part of EU law, is it even necessary for it to be explicitly mentioned to be applicable on the territory of the European Union? The European Court of Justice has made a very valuable contribution to the debate in December 2016, when it made a ruling concerning the Western Sahara case. And in the ruling, they stated that the principle of self-determination is applicable to all non-self-governing territories and to all peoples who have not yet achieved independence. It is moreover a legally enforceable right, erga omnes. It's an interesting choice of words, and it's relevant because even though in this particular situation the European Court of Justice was dealing with a decolonization case, they chose not to refer to any of the multiple UN resolutions that deal specifically with decolonization, but they referred to Article 1 of the UN Charter and spoke of all people. But putting that aside, looking at every other EU law sources reveals that the self-determination as a concept, principle, or human right is absent from these texts. Certain European human rights instruments, such as the Helsinki Final Pact of 1975 and the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990, did feature references to self-determination, but these are political documents, and as such, they're not legal documents, they do not form part of EU law. It could be assumed that because there are certain political implications to EU member states by the right of self-determination, that this is maybe the reason why it was not specifically mentioned in the treaty. Because it is difficult to make any conclusions on the EU's position towards self-determination by looking at EU legal documents, I turn to political statements by the EU, and more specifically, statements made in the context of the United Nations. In October 2001, an EU representative stated that conditions need to be present in order for the right of self-determination to be applied, such as freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and most importantly, the right to vote through which people can give a mandate to representatives that best serve their interests and their views. And this is an interesting perspective because it makes self-determination synonymous with a democratic system of government. And this view has been reiterated several times by EU representatives in the UN, where they said that holding elections is an expression of the right of peoples to self-determination, and the process of democratization is an essential stage in the recognition of the right of people to self-determination. While it stands to reason that naturally self-determination is related to other human rights, the EU appears to be equating it to democracy to such an extent that it eclipses what self-determination of people was intended to mean in the first place. It's a simplification of self-determination to mean participation of citizens in the political processes of their countries. It overshadows to a certain degree the common Article 1 of the International Covenants, according to which the right to self-determination of peoples means the freedom to determine their political status. By framing the matter in such a way, the EU sets out the basis and limits the context in which it chooses to promote this right internationally. So it chooses to promote the right as calling for spread of democracy and rule of law. It follows that from this point of view, peoples who already enjoy a full range of human rights within their countries and are able to self-determine by expressing their views through elections are by nature able to self-determine already, and therefore external self-determination would be unnecessary when we have democracy. Why is it so? Because it's viewed that democracy allows people to practice internal self-determination. And internal self-determination can come in many forms. And in this particular case, I've grouped them in the ways they are present within the European Union context in minority rights, language rights, and regional rights. With regards to minority rights, prior to the Lisbon Treaty, there was no legal basis for group rights of national minorities in member states, and protection against discrimination was based on general human rights instruments. And it was viewed that when there are strong individual rights, there would be no need for group rights, and this goes along with the civic identity that is supported by the idea of the European Union. The mere fact, however, that the EU did include respect for minorities in the Lisbon Treaty does signify a step forward. Language rights, to a similar extent, were also mentioned in the Lisbon Treaty, where it states that the Union will respect the rich cultural and linguistic diversity within its borders, and this applies not only to the 24 official languages in the Union, but also to the almost 60 regional and minority languages spoken on its territory. This is particularly relevant to languages which are have official use within their countries, within member states, such as the Catalan Basque in Spain, or the Welsh and Scottish Gaelic in the UK. And the EU has been quite open to a certain degree. European institutions have been open to allow for certain rights for these languages. For example, the European Parliament has encouraged promotion of these languages, and it decided in 2006 that native speakers of these regional languages can address Parliament in their own language and receive a response in the language. But those regional languages cannot be used in plenary sessions, which is reserved for the official languages of the EU. Similar provisions were made by the European Council as well. But it's important to know that these benefits or privileges for such regional rights have to be first approved and requested on the part of the member state itself. So it wasn't something granted by the EU to a regional language, but rather something that a member state had consented to. And finally, we look at regional rights, which is a very, very interesting topic, because in the 1990s there emerged the concept of Europe of the regions, which was such a novelty and an interesting way to effectively serve two purposes. Number one, to give regions the opportunity to be gradually included in the policy-making processes of the European Union as a third actor, and to promote a multi-layered policy-making structure. And at the same time, to dilute the relevance of nation-states by bringing regions to the forefront of European policy-making. Over the years, regions have begun opening lobbying offices in Brussels, and there were only 15 regional offices in 1988. By 2017, there were almost 200 regional offices in Brussels. There are, however, problems with this idea of opportunities for internal self-determination within the EU, and the major one is that the EU has no legislative competences in this area. Keeping in mind the subsidiarity principle, competences which are not explicitly conferred to the EU remain in the remits of member states, and issues concerning language, culture, education, and regions are such matters. Even though we can generally agree that member states of the EU do accept and support the promotion of language rights and minority rights in the general context for social inclusion, non-discrimination, protection of culture, and so on, there have been certain instances of reservation. For example, when the Council of Europe brought the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities in 1995, or European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, several EU member states either decided to not sign it or not ratify these conventions for their own political beliefs and reasons. There are many aspects that guide this. And as I said, with regards to the use of languages, it's the prerogative of member states to allow for those languages to be used on the European level. So what happens is that European support for such internal self-determination mechanism is reduced to moral support, declaratory support, but they can't really do, the Union itself can't really do anything without the agreement of individual member states. The Committee of the Region, which was created, has proved to be inefficient because it's only an advisory body and represents on equal terms all subnational entities, from large cultural regions to municipalities and administrative regions, which doesn't allow, it's seen as a source of ineffectiveness because it doesn't allow to fill the gap between cultural regions and policy making. And last, I look at the state recognition practice of the EU as an indication of their attitudes towards self-determination. And I will try to be brief. It's a good thing that there are relatively recent examples in the wider European region that we can look at to gain some perspective of how the EU acts when we have new declarations of independence. And if we look at the case of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the European community at the time met in Brussels and issued declarations on recognitions of new states, which proposed a set of legal requirements on that were basically a normative criteria that needed to be met in order for there to be recognition of these new states. And it was an interesting idea that this entire process of recognition of new states would be guided by normative criteria, by legal criteria and not political criteria. There was even the establishment of the Arbitration Commission, which was tasked to evaluate the level and the extent to which individual countries met the criteria. However, somewhere along the line, this idea became diluted, and the Arbitration Committee was only able to give advisory, non-binding legal opinion. And what happened was the Arbitration Committee, looking at the criteria, decided that only Republic of Slovenia and Macedonia met the criteria at the time, whereas Croatia and Bosnia needed to take additional measures. In specific terms, Croatia needed to add respect for ethnic minorities, and Bosnia had problems establishing control over the territory and had not held a referendum, which is considered a prerequisite. It was early January when the decision of the Arbitration Committee, early January of 1992, when this Arbitration Committee came with these findings. But a few weeks earlier, in late December 1991, Germany had already decided that it would recognize Croatia and Slovenia. Soon after Germany, a number of other countries that were then part of the European community, today the European Union, decided to also recognize Slovenia and Croatia. And there were a lot of political circumstances that guided this decision. On one hand, there was conflict in Bosnia, there was political problems in Macedonia with its southern neighbor. A lot of Catholic countries recognized immediately Croatia and Slovenia, but not Macedonia, which was dominantly Orthodox, or Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was dominantly Muslim. So there were many aspects guiding this decision. But most importantly is that these past cases of recognition of new independent states were guided by political expediency, primarily, and not normative criteria. Similar example was the case of Kosovo many years later, where there wasn't even the attempt, following the failed attempt to have normative criteria for recognition, there wasn't even an attempt to have any legal standards of statehood before recognition was issued, and the EU decided to leave it up to individual member states to decide based on their own policy and their own views how they would proceed. Some have recognized it, others have not. In conclusion, the EU practice of recognition of states has in fact, in spite of all of this, in spite of how arbitrary these actions have been, they have in fact recognized every independence claim that has appeared in the European continent, almost every independence claim, with the notable exception of Republika Srpska and to a certain degree Kosovo. What does that tell us? It tells us that the EU does in fact recognize outcomes of self-determination movements if and when they materialize into effective independent states as a factual situation. So briefly, to conclude, the EU integration is viewed as incompatible with external self-determination. People can self-determine through participating in democratic processes. There's support for different forms of internal self-determination for peoples in the EU, but there's no power to implement those policies, and EU's recognition of new states is dependent on political expediency.
Thank you very much, Mara. With this presentation, we have seen how the implementation of self-determination can be arbitrary and divided into organically external and internal self-determination. And the next presentation will be Mikhail Donlon, participating from US, University of Mass. And the topic is self-determination and climate change.
Mr. Dalton.
Thank you, Cooper. This has been really edifying to me because where I come from, we are well behind the curve on human rights in North America. And we're behind a lot of curves right now. To hear how you folks have gone through issue by issue by issue by issue, and of course, what I'm about to say is the opposite of issue by issue by issue, because suddenly we have what I call a ubiquitous encounter for all humanity from climate change. A ubiquitous encounter for all humanity. And never before has any court, whether it be human rights or the rest of the court, ever tried to cope with a ubiquitous where all humanity, by using fossil fuel, 80% of our fuel energy is fossil fuel, and it's creating global warming in a frightening degree, and it's bearing down on all humanity. And so, in the last few years, I've been looking at this matter holistically, which is very comfortable for me because although I've read a lot of the American human rights courts, we in North America managed to duck most of those courts, although they're getting closer and closer. I've been very impressed where our Inter-American Court was able to come up with very well sound principles on the human right of a livable environment. And that is just in the nick of time, that there is a human right to a livable environment. Human right to health, human right to life, articulated on into a livable environment. When I studied law, we were always wrestling with it. We wrestled with it enough to know what the word meant, although we found out the concept was almost indivisible. It's interstitial. The legal process finds ways of connecting way down in the interstices of the body of law, and rarely deals with matters holistically. So I feel like I'm coming in a counterpoint to two ideal presentations of folks who have taken the course of human rights, self-determination, through courts that are far beyond what the average North American encounters. But thank God for those human rights courts, because we are now dealing with issues of life and death, and in a holistic way, the opposite of interstitial. When I was studying law, there was no such thing as environmental law. Of course, I've been practicing law for 50 years, and we've had a tremendous upgrowth of environmental law studies in the United States, very much so, very much. And although we wouldn't have, except for Senator Muskie's tricks, he would go to committee hearings before everybody got there, and he would stay long after everybody had left. And since most people wanted in and out on environmental issues, he ruled the roost. And he came up with our Clean Air Act, and by 1990, the amendments to the Clean Air Act, and how he got first George Bush to come on board. I don't know, but he did. They did. We did. So we have a good environmental law until the last couple of years. But I want to cast my approach here as a yin and yang to your approach, which is very, very well articulated, and further along in articulation in courts where I come from. But I'm afraid we're going into something unheard of, unexperienced, and I want to keep talking about ubiquity of injury. Ubiquity of injury in the delivery of the injury and the receipt of the injury. So, rightly, we all had to stand, all had to wrestle with the concept of standing. And because the courts use that as a device, because if I can't figure it out, I say, well, you don't understand me asking that. And courts often can't figure it out. So let me say that hopefully some of the things I say provide a push of the envelope. We've got to push the envelope because climate change is changing everything. Everything. And I do want to affirm, as I put on the top of my notes here, all peoples have a right to self-determination, and by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic and social, cultural development. And I think in terms of basic human fulfillment, group fulfillment, a lot of issues. But I'm trying to, my presentation, draw a link between self-determination and climate change, if I may. And I tip my hat to you folks. As Mary Robinson has been telling us, climate change is coming down hard on all human rights, including self-determination. Coming down hard on all human rights. And I'm going to cite an example here where we are about to encounter an injury upon self-determination. An early blow on a major human right that is going to create the most extreme injustice in history. If I may. We're looking at the fact that we have islands in the Pacific and islands in the Indian Ocean and the peninsular agronomies in Asia, like Bangladesh, many others, are about to be inundated with rising sea level. Global warming, sea gets warm, ice melts, seas rise, and I can tell you after 5 years of study, which if you've only read bits and pieces, they're not telling you what's really going to happen with the rising seas. This is a real problem. And you have people who live on islands in the Pacific, and Indian Ocean, Bangladesh, who are going to lose their land. And with it goes right away the right of self-determination. Suddenly they're migrants. Suddenly they're on the road. Now this is quite the opposite of the individual cases that we were looking at there. Very deeply pursued individual cases. Individual, and as started in the United States, our environmental law is always anecdotal and incremental. We haven't yet got to holistic analysis, but we're getting there. So I'm trying to advance the concept that the legal process, which I define as the rule of law, the legal process, the two together are incapable of handling global warming. incapable. The legal rule of law we know, gone for centuries, what we all rely on. We admire every nation that has a rule of law, and it pays off always for the people. And in this case, we don't have to define the people. Again, we're talking ubiquity. Now, on top of that, we have human rights, which is now starting to be articulated as if it's written out law. Until I came into the practice of law, human rights was an unwritten code of laws, never adopted until 1948 when the United Nations codified Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that was on international law basis. And if you talk about international law to the folks back home, they'd say, tell me more about it. I didn't hear a lot about that. What is that? International law. Well, you folks know it. You folks practice it. You're way ahead. But you're not way ahead with the issue of ubiquity. Nobody is. And so it's to that end that we're dealing with a way of changing the rule of law and its companion legal process to bring in and mainstream human rights. Mainstream it into domestic law so that it's not only in international law, where it's now well established, but also domestic law. Ironically, almost everybody's constitution has a replete inclusion of human rights. But it's not a persuasive argument that you're stuck with. I submit it's got to be mainstreamed in order for civilization to cope with a sudden, ubiquitous injury by all people on all people. Now, you who have centered yourself on self-determination, I admire that, because although I've really been a lawyer who's been in and out of government and in and out of political campaigns and in and out of the practice of law, it's pretty tough. I can tell you to spend your whole life practicing law. Don't do it. Unless you can get in and out, in and out, in and out, and so you can exert your passions. If you really are, but boy, you got passions, and you're going to be able to get in and out and get allies and get something moving. We have the thesis here of international law, domestic law, and right now there's a problem and a nexus between the two. It's a problem. And if it wasn't for the fact that the world, I submit, is in extremis, that nexus would be asymptotic. We'll almost get there, but now we have to vault that. We have to. Somebody has done it. Think about it. Your EU has picked up a lot of the good work of the UN's Human Rights Council. And the EU has articulated further, and France just took it a whole leap for the nexus. How many are familiar with the new law in France that obligates all major corporations to submit in writing to the world their view of what, well, this is delightful because I want to announce it. In the year, I think it probably was going through the French legislature in 2017, and the French legislature had a devil of a time. How dare anybody say that a major corporation in France, and we're France, must tell everybody what harm we're going to do to human rights. First of all, no one has ever asked the question, what harm do you do to human rights? Never asked anybody that question, anywhere. The first time human rights came out in writing was in the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. That was the first treaty that used the term human rights. It is becoming current. And as it becomes current, you folks in Europe will be way ahead. Now, not only does this corporation, all these French corporations, I'm at a punchline. That's perfect. I'm going to conclude with this statute. Major corporations, all their subsidiaries, all their supply chains, all their value chains, all their labor unions, all their stakeholders will all comment on this promulgation of the injury we project we're going to do to human rights. Now, if you're in the garment industry, you could rightly worry about what you might do in Bangladesh to make people be in a building that's about to burn down, which happened. Or in India, Bhopal, massive injury, human rights. Well, what about fossil fuel companies? What do fossil fuel companies predict the harm that they are going to do to human rights and to the environment? What about all their subsidiaries? What about all their distributors? What about all their labor unions? I submit that this is a scene changer. This is a scene changer. It came out of the EU, came out of France, and I submit our goal is to take that French statute and make it ubiquitous. Take it around the world. Make it one of your pushes for self-determination. That, yes, we can bring human rights into this dynamic, make it mainstream, and doing that, we create a positive nexus between domestic law and international law. So, I conclude by saying, we've got to have a call to arms. There's never been an international call to arms. No one's ever led the world to full self-determination. So we're trying to do something we've never done before, and there hangs it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalton. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much. And with your presentation, I mean, it will be my personal comment. I've seen how the human rights are evolving and where it is leading, especially in terms of self-determination. When we think about, we can see that the negative impacts of climate change are also pushing us to think about where the self-determination rights are going, and as all the panelists mentioned, there is a huge gap between the theory and the practice. Thank you again. And now I would like to kick off the question time. I know some of your background of the participants, you are coming from a human rights background. Even if not, I'm sure you're interested in because you're here. So any of you have any questions would you like to start with? Or are you going to give this role to me also? Yeah, hands up.
I have a question for you.
And also, sorry, I just want to say, could you also mention your background before you ask the question very shortly and for everyone?
I work along with the ICO team. I study politics and mainly sort of modules in sort of identity politics and migration. So I have a question for you. How do you think that governments can reconcile the need for sort of equality of opportunities that does require a nation to sort of adopt a set language, a national language, with the need for communities to also protect their cultural heritage and also be allowed to practice their own language within their own communities?
Would you like to know?
It's not a simple task because, as you will see, practice around the world differs greatly. Different countries choose different methods. In an ideal world, what we would have is a single unifying language in a country that serves as the administrative language and makes it possible for people to communicate with each other and for the society to function, basically, so that there's no silent or open division within a single state. And in an ideal situation, you have that one official language, but then you also have recognition for minority languages, and you provide certain rights and opportunities for groups to practice their own culture within their communities, not overriding, of course, the national sovereignty. But this is very rarely the case, and I think it really depends on individual circumstances per country. What works in France, where language policies can be quite strict, and what works in other parts of Europe or around the world can be quite different, but it's also guided by the circumstances in that country. And I'm very, very against using examples from a particular country to guide another nation state into their own policy making, because you could never equally replicate those conditions. So I'm sorry I'm not able to give a better answer.
Brighton Caballo, initially Minister of Religion, but I also studied international law.
Yeah, we have a mic. If you would like to use.
I think I'll be loud enough.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'll be loud enough. Yeah, I probably slightly follow on to that as you presented the EU and the right of self-determination of peoples. I couldn't help but remember my own background from Africa at the time, when it was the height of championing for self-determination. Could we see Brexit or Britain within EU that same cry? We want our country back, we want our sovereignty back, as a self-determination within an institution that has trapped a people and wanting to be free from whatever norms or policies or whatever they're left for. But the sound I could equate. We want our village back. We want our country back. We want to live. And from all divides, of politics, you could see this, the Labour or Conservative, but the cry from the ground was, we want our country back. In a nutshell, could you see within the EU, and I might as well say, I don't know, I hope I'm wrong, you could see Switzerland, Italy, a little bit in France. This is emerging. We almost like a trapped people within an institution. Sorry for repeating myself, but I hope I've made the point.
This is exactly the tricky part with the right to self-determination. It's been so illy defined, or not defined properly at all, and it's been left vague, I believe, on purpose. many, many decades ago when it was first brought to the forefront in the UN Charter, that a lot of people can make it mean what they would like it to mean, and it's very difficult to even claim the right, as James previously argued, because it's such a vague concept that even though it was believed to be a right of peoples who don't have a country, a state, an independent state, to claim that self-governance, it has come in many forms in more recent times. My research has always been focused on self-determination for peoples who do not have their own independent state. I don't even focus on minority groups which live in certain countries but have their own native states. And Brexit is an interesting one because, for all intents and purposes, the British people are able to self-determine by the mere fact that they have the United Kingdom as a fatherland. Self-determination, I would believe, even though it's very vaguely defined, would apply more to cultural groups, ethnic groups, linguistic groups, which do not have their own, they do not have a government that represents them. But in terms of the European Union, what does apply here is the fact that the UK is regaining sovereignty, because as I said, the European Union as a concept does believe in the shared sovereignty. It does believe in the consensual decision making. So by leaving the European Union, I wouldn't say that the UK is gaining self-determination or using the right to self-determination, but they are reclaiming a part of their sovereignty. That's how I would define it.
When someone argues of saying, when I leave this institution, I'll be able to network with a wider community out there. By remaining in that institution, I feel trapped. If I leave, I'll trade with the others who I'm limited by you. I may be reading weird things, but
as I said,
I'm equating this with...
It's an issue of sovereignty and sovereign decision making, more so than self-determination. It's a decision of being able to make those choices as a nation state rather than as a collective.
Other panelists would like to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of clarify, I think what Teresa made both last 50, you said it was an act of self-determination. Now, whether, I mean, it's a matter of international law whether we can invoke it against an international organisation. No obvious basis for doing it, but then equally, the whole point about self-determination is usually invoked when you don't have the right to it as a matter of law. Self-determination is usually invoked as a way of challenging the existing legal order, whether in the case of decolonisation, that challenge was actually to the UN Charter. And in fact, it was a demand to reinterpret the UN Charter, which actually allowed colonialism. In secession, you invoke the right to self-determination essentially to break up the state and establish constitutional order. So self-determination tends, I mean, it has a really kind of ambivalent attitude towards law, because it although it's sort of, the idea is that you enjoy self-determination within a free state under the rule of law, under constitutional government, to represent the people. At the same time, the right is more frequently invoked where people find that the law does not follow their interests and the way of challenging it. The only other example I can think of actually self-determination being raised against an international organisation was actually in the case of Kosovo. And Kosovo was run by the UN from 1999, and in 2004 there were riots in Kosovo, and then the US started to think about their exit strategy. And ultimately, the way it was done was very sort of a sleight of hand that the politicians from institutions set up by the United Nations, being run by the United Nations, and that they design these institutions and they define their powers. And these politicians got together in Kosovo and we are the people of Kosovo, and we declare our independence. And this was later brought by the Serbians to the International Court of Justice. And one of the arguments was, well, these were set up by the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council didn't give them the powers to do this. They're exceeding their powers by doing this. And the court said, well, actually, it wasn't these institutions, it was the people of Kosovo. So they kind of bought into it. That, you know, these people who had previously been the parliament and the president of Kosovo got together and they called themselves something else, and they created a new legal framework from that. So I think that's the. But the question with Kosovo is always, Kosovo declared its independence in 2008. Who did it declare its independence from? Did it declare its independence from Serbia? Yes, formally it declared its independence from Serbia. But in terms of who's governing the country, in terms of who suddenly lost their power, it was the UN. They effectively declared their independence from the UN.
Hi, I'm Tanya Herring, also from the United States. I am studying in Bangor, Wales, international criminal law, international human rights. I wanted to address the colleague from the United States, and I definitely can relate to your perspective, and I can still see, sure, thank you. I can definitely relate to your perspective. And I still can see the United States or North America still experiencing some challenges when it comes to self-determination. Often when I have conversations with other people about North America, I have to go back and remind them of the geographical spectrum that we have. We're huge. And not to count the islands and other areas and the territories. So to get that many people to truly grasp an understanding of the international concept of human rights has its own challenges within itself. If I were to go to Montana, I'll just pick Montana out of and say anything about self-determination and international law relates to that, I would probably get looked at like I have a third eye because it's so foreign to them. And then I ask why, and my response to that would be because the whole concept of international law is not as interwoven into the United States or the North American society, and in Canada. I spent some time in Canada as well.
It's not in our ethos.
I'm sorry?
It's not in our ethos.
It's not. It's not. It's just simply not.
It's got to get there, but I don't know how.
And I concur with you 100%. We've got a long way to go in that regard. And I think it's because it's not interwoven, it's not interchanged. Even when I speak to people who study international law, and that was the main reason why I came overseas to study international law, because I wanted to get out of that bubble of what they think international law is or isn't. So we have ways to go. We're making some strides. I concur with you there. But I do think we have a long way to go with regard to understanding the concepts of self-determination, the concepts of international human rights law, and how we can bring that all to fruition for North America to be part of the rest of the international community.
Yes, I think you captured what I was trying to get two hands on very well, and thank you. My feeling is that we wouldn't get there from here unless we can convince people in the United States that we're supposed to lead and lead in a complementary fashion. We've done that in the past. We're not doing it now. But because we're not doing it so abysmally, people might say, hey, it's time to do it again. Let's hope. But we have to know at home that the globe is in extremis. We have to know that and say, because we've got to know that, we've got to understand that law came up through the ground, through history, through geography, and then at some point there are some questions of global issues. And here's a global issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wish I had. My hope is that we could take that French law, and while I was preparing, I said to myself, hey, somebody's already come up with something. And furthermore, it went through the whole committee process, and it was hard, it was strongly debated, and all sides said, well, wait a minute, you know, this is France, but they did it.
But if I can just make one final comment to that, and I hear those kind of comments a lot, I travel extensively. And then when I hear that, I say, but look at the size of France. Oh, pick a state. Ohio. Ohio is about the size of France. And so we have so much geography. It's almost impossible, and we're such a melting pot, to be able to develop something that innate with human rights.
Yeah.
So I just don't see it
Yeah.
being something that we
wouldn't
can do.
Unless somebody, I don't know who the somebody be,
It's
but
okay.
convince America, along with everybody, that we're in a crisis, we're in extremis. The best of us have to come forward. We got to do something to start a ball rolling.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We can get to final questions, or one or two questions more. Have any? Actually, myself, I would like to then complete a final question. You mentioned about right to water and how it's related with how it can be used to solve the right to self-determination issues at a legal basis. But also there are some general comments that I know they're taking care to comment on the covenants. Are there any other examples that we can use for right to self-determination from the general comments? Are there any that you're aware of that you can remember? Or what would you say?
I mean, so you've got two sets of general comments. I mean, you've also got a couple of general comments coming out of the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination that runs the session. So you've got, from the Human Rights Committee, you've got general comment 23, where they talked about minorities. You've got, I mean, they did general comment 12, which did specifically deal with self-determination, but that was so vague, it was unbelievable. And you've got general comment 25 on the right to participate in government. Again, it's a political covenant. In relation to the economic and social committee, so there's not such a direct reference in the other general comments, but all the other general comments usually make provision for the specific context of indigenous peoples these days. So in a lot of different general comments, then there are references to indigenous peoples. So you can see that sort of connecting there.
Which are one of the main, can we say maybe victims or subjects of the right to self-determination?
I mean, certainly the Committee on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, in its reporting guidance, calls on states to report on indigenous people under Article 1. So they're framing their rights as a self-determination issue. Not specifically under UNDRA. No, this is actually under Article 1 of the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. And the annual, and the periodic report later. And they do that. There is actually a lot of reporting on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, we have one more. Sorry, just final.
One more question to Michael. You mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation about climate change as an issue and the right to sort of livable life. Do you think that one of the ways that we could encourage people to see that the global issue is something to act on right now. If we linked the issue of climate change, the issue of poverty, because you talked about the right to live a life, and I think a lot of the time the issues are offered in separation rather than together. Do you think there would be something
Link what with what?
Sorry, so you talk to poverty, so link climate change issues to issues of poverty, because you talked about a right to a livable life, and I thought whether you thought that would be sort of an idea as a kind of try to make people see the issue as a global one rather than one to deal with as individuals.
Yeah, I don't know how to get the global posse going. And I come from America where we're, you know, hip deep in local politics. Everybody is. I keep thinking of the term extremist. Now that's a military term where you're about to lose your theater of war, and you say, I'm an extremist, and every other division has to wheel around and support you. Whether you're going ashore in Normandy or Lady Gulf. And it works when you're an extremist, and they know you're about to collapse. How we do that, I don't know.
Maybe this can be another discussion for the break time. Yeah. Thank you very much. Now we have here, if you can stand up, you know Kansas is the place where we have Ben, Fred and Adu. If you can just stand up, because our coffee times are upstairs and they will help you to find the coffee place. It's just upstairs on the right side, but you can follow me and my colleagues, and we need to be